All right, guys, the next one here is be our second day notes for the week. We're going to call it Shots Fired. This is where there's actually going to be some bloodshed between the English redcoats and the English colonists. And remember the last slide, we talked about a bunch of steps leading up to the Revolutionary War. These are going to be some further steps. They're going to drastically increase tension because in a lot of these cases, people are actually going to be fighting. And in some cases, you're actually going to have some deaths. So here we have, a famous painting of a battle during the American Revolution. One thing you'll notice about these battles, if you ever see, say like a History Channel video or like a recreation, they're always walking in lines. You can see the British Redcoats are very famous for this. They perfected it. They were the strongest military in the world in the 18th and 19th century. They're kind of like, the United States today. We have a very strong military, very long reach. So did the British back in that time period. Right? And the reason for them firing in lines is because the guns back then, that musket ball was very inaccurate. So when a bullet came out, if you look at this guy with his musket up, kind of like if you ever shot a paintball or an airsoft gun, those guns tend to be very inaccurate because the ammunition is going to go up and down. So the chance of actually hitting someone isn't as great as it is today. Obviously today you would never walk in lines like this because the guns today are a lot more accurate and also a lot more deadly at that point. So our first slide today, we want to talk about the Boston Massacre. This is of course, in Boston in 1770, and British soldiers will fire on a group of colonists in the streets of Boston. Now, there's going to be some conflicting reports about, how innocent are these colonists. It is heading towards the middle of the night. You're talking late at night, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night, and you're going to have these colonists here. They're going to start throwing stuff at British redcoats. Again, there's a lot of tension between these two groups. Britain's going to have a huge presence, military presence in Boston. And the idea you're throwing rocks and bottles at people with guns, probably not the best idea. And even though the order was given not to fire on the colonists, someone does, and 5 colonists end up being killed. Now, if you think about the term massacre, does it really sound like a massacre of 5 people? No, but to sell this in the newspaper, this event's also called a bloody massacre. It needs to stand out, kind of like, media does the same thing today, try to over exaggerate within reason to sell newspapers or to draw attention to something. This picture right here is actually famously produced by a guy named Paul Revere. Right? This engraving will be seen everywhere. The colonists are actually avid readers, and they're going to be sending writers and information throughout the colonies. So even before the news of this event gets back to England, which could be 2 months by boat, maybe even 3, the colonists will know within a week or so what's going on because they're all going to be reading the same newspaper. Not the same newspaper, they're all going to be reading a newspaper about this event, no matter where they are. Even if they're on a plantation in South Carolina, they would have heard of the Boston Massacre. And again, you're going to increase tension between the two. And this is still going to be 5 years before, shots are actually fired in the war. Next, we're going to talk about the Boston Tea Party. Oops, spelled something wrong here. But this is led by the Sons of Liberty in 1775. Sons of Liberty are a group of people in Boston who basically don't like being controlled by England anymore. They're looking for freedom and liberty. And in response to the tax on tea, the colonists are going to dress up like Native Americans. You see in this picture, they're going to dump tea into Boston Harbor. We talked about in the previous slide how England was increasing taxes to pay for the war effort, and there's a lot of pushback, and there's a lot of complaints because of these taxes. And in response, England will actually get rid of all taxes by 1775, except the tax on tea. And so to kind of, show our unhappiness with that tax, these colonists, part of the Sons of Liberty, are going to dump $1 million worth of tea in Boston Harbor. Groups of the Sons of Liberty, talking like people like John Hancock. John Hancock and John Adams. Okay, very considered founding fathers today. And because of this event, England will respond with shutting down Boston Harbor. And we talked about this in class when we did the colonial map. Boston is one of the biggest ports in the world at that time, especially one of the biggest ports in the colonies. A lot of goods are coming out of that port. And when you shut down that port, you're going to have, a quarter of the population will go unemployed immediately in Boston. because a lot of people working in Boston rely on that port, whether they're working on a ship, building ships, running a business that transports things on ships. They rely on that harbor being open for business. So when it gets shut down, again, you're frustrating colonists, and it's just going to keep adding, and eventually we're going to have a war on our hands. Next slide here, we're going to talk about this. This is the First and Second Continental Congress. First Continental Congress was going to be held before the Boston Tea Party. This is in 1774. And basically, that the famous no taxation without representation is going to carry through on this Continental Congress. We want to be represented in England so that we can have representation for taxes. What we didn't like is that in Parliament, where these taxes were being levied, we had no say or had no vote. And their colonists are asking for that representation, and England is denying them. Another very famous thing comes out of this, in 1774, you're going to have unity coming out of the First Continental Congress. The idea that, you're no longer a New Yorker or a Virginian or a South Carolinian, you're an American. So if one colony was attacked by England, all the colonies would help each other. Again, the term American, it gets used here for one of the first times in our history. And then there's another Continental Congress that happens in 1776, which is going to be after Lexington Concord, which is our next slide coming up. Happens in the early 1776. And what they're going to decide here is that they're going to give up searching for peace. Throughout this last 20 years, they've been trying to maintain peace in England because they understand that England is a very powerful nation, and going to war with England is not going to be just as simple as, hey, we're going to war, we win. It's going to cost a lot of lives, and realistically, even at the start of the war, America will be the underdog. And the biggest thing that comes out of the Continental Congress, besides giving up on peace, is that it will lead to the writing of the Declaration of Independence, which is probably one of the most, and even not in just U.S. history, but world history, one of the most influential documents ever. And we're going to spend some time on this next week going over that. Okay, so First Continental Congress, unity. Second Continental Congress, Declaration of Independence, and hey, we're committed to this war. We're going through with it. Okay, here you got a picture, just a drawing or painting of the First Continental Congress, and there's George Washington in the center there, kind of just giving a little talk to some of the other founding fathers. You can see the famous one, Ben Franklin, sitting right there as well. Okay. And our last slide here is going to be called Lexington Concord. This will be the first battles of the American Revolution. This is the idea of, one if by land, two if by sea. Paul Revere is going to have his famous ride here. Paul Revere is not the only person who did this ride. There's actually two other people. Two people actually get caught. Well, 2/3 of them get caught trying to actually get out the word of the British are coming. But Paul Revere's name is the one who's kind of carried through history. During this time, Britain is going to leave Boston, and they're going to go into the countryside looking for guns and ammo. It was actually, colonists are not allowed to have stockpiles of guns. Kind of the reason we have the Second Amendment today is because we weren't allowed to have guns back then, and the idea if we had guns we could protect ourselves back then was really big. So Britain heads out looking for guns and ammo. They're also looking for two men, John Hancock and John Adams. They're wanted fugitives. They're considered treasonous against England. If they actually got caught, they would have been killed. And the word gets out before the British get to these two towns, and all the guns and ammo that was stored in Lexington Concord, and mostly paid for by John Hancock, realistically, will have been moved or hidden. So they don't find anything they're looking for. They don't find the people. They don't find the guns. But what's happened with Revere and the other two men who are going to be going out on this ride, they're going to alert these Minutemen that the British are coming. These are basically militia, people who can gather their weapons and be ready to fight in a minute, and that's where that Minutemen moniker comes from. And at the first battle in Lexington, the colonists were not really ready. They weren't gathered yet. But by Concord, you're going to have a couple thousand colonists meeting in Concord. So this group of about a couple hundred British soldiers who did really, obviously, did well at Lexington because there was not that many people on the field, are going to have their hands full at Concord, and they're going to end up having to retreat 25 miles back to Boston. And there's the idea, what's called the funneling effect, when they're walking back to Boston. You know, imagine a great example. Imagine if you're walking from Aner, going right down 501 to Myrtle Beach, is about 20 miles, and every tree and house you passed, you're being shot at on the way back. And that's what that walk back to Boston was like for these British soldiers. And this event is often very famously referred to as a shot heard round the world. It's going to alert the world of the revolution, and then it'll also inspire other countries to do the same. You know, the people are going to look at this event and they're going to be like, wow, if America's rebelling against England, this is one of the first times there's an open rebellion of like the colonies against a mother country. And because of this rebellion, other countries will see this and they will do the same. You know, it's called the shot heard around the world, not because it was so loud that everyone can hear it, but because around the world, this event was heard and will lead to other people or other countries doing the same. And then they'll all write their own Declaration of Independence, which we'll talk about again next week, which will go along with that. All right, guys, that's this slide. Again, hope you have a good one.